All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture video. We are going to be talking about the career choice within the field of corrections. Now, obviously, this week, yes, you have your final exam. Uh, so there is that. I've made sure that all your quizzes are graded up till this point. I do have to grade what if scenario 3, but otherwise, I have done a catch up on those grades. So feel free to use those as study methods for your exam because I used questions from your exams or from your quizzes in the final. Um, but anyway, we also have the interview with Lieutenant Mike Coleman here in Erie County Corrections. He ran the actual training program for Corrections Academy and everything for quite a few years, and he works in, again, Erie County Corrections. But was really excited to answer your questions, so I did interview him, and that video is available already. It's been available, I think, since Sunday. But yeah, so that is the primary point of, or rather, the primary lecture, I guess, of this week is that interview with him, simply because, well, everything else up until this point has been learning about the field, and this last one is just kind of talking about the career choices that are available in this field. And so, yeah, what better way than to end it with that and have a somewhat short final lecture because we still have to have a lecture to have content. But anything that's said in this lecture video is not on the exam. I'm saying that now with a caveat because nothing new added here is on the exam. Everything else is potentially review fair game. So again, we're talking about career choices, and so really the textbook, the primary textbook, text one, breaks it down into these three areas: public agencies, private sector, and specialized personnel. And yeah, we're going to use that to talk about it, but so realistically, public agencies, these are the ones that people are most familiar with. These are the outward facing ones. These are correctional officers, parole officers, things of that nature, all those individuals who work within the corrections field that are public service agents. They are people who are funded through the government. They are technically government agents. They are government employees, that kind of thing. The other public agency, particularly that's brought up, is bailiffs, which is a court officer. They have very similar roles and things of that nature. So it's important to note that, the public agencies are what most people are familiar with. But before we talk about anything more with that, I want to talk about the private sector a little bit because we don't really talk too much about it. But the private sector really comes to, in as far as corrections are concerned, there's a difference between a government prison, a public prison or public jail, and a privately owned prison. As we have talked about some issues within corrections, specifically juvenile corrections, was the Kids for Cash scandal in Luzerne County, PA. They were being sent to a private juvenile facility. So those are the private sector things. There's still the same roles that you have in the public agencies. The difference is you're not a government employee, you're or a government of the state. You are an employee of a private individual, a private company, a private property, LLC, whatever it may be, that owns that prison. So while yes, they still operate on behalf of the law and you still have to go through the same kind of trainings, the difference is you are not a government employee, you are a private employee. So I wanted to talk about that briefly. But outside of the private sector, in particularly in corrections, this is a general statement across the board. This is about policing. This is about criminal law. This is about corrections. The private sector for criminal justice is fairly robust or fairly fleshed out. There's a lot of opportunities, and they're in very similar and simplistic things that are related to what we've talked about over the course of all these different classes. So it shouldn't really be a surprise, but I want to emphasize that when we're talking, we have the spot here to talk about career choice in criminal justice. Yeah, our focus is in corrections, but private security is part of the private sector of criminal justice. Private surveillance is part of the private sector of criminal justice. So these are things to consider if you're trying to think of what kind of career could you use with a criminal justice degree. Well, if you don't want to be a police officer, you don't want to be a lawyer, you don't want to be a corrections officer, you could go into private security, private surveillance. You can go into those fields with criminal justice. But going back to that public agency, private sector, talking about in particular, not just bailiff in a court, but in particular in correctional facilities, there is this need for specialized personnel. And so our textbook talks about the California Prison Industry Authority, but both in the interview with Mike Holman and my own conversations with Lieutenant Holman outside of our class, he has offered assistance in regards to our program development as a whole. In that conversation, we have talked about the needs of Erie County Corrections and how that's formulated. And really, what a lot of people don't understand is that, and hopefully by the end of this class, through everything we've talked about, you kind of come to understand this, that facilities, the correctional facilities like prisons where individuals are kept, are like mini societies. They are these mini models of the outside world. And so they're not just, the need in the correctional facilities is not just officers and agents, it's everything. If you're IT and you really are good with computers and figuring out problems, there are IT positions in corrections. If you're really good at welding, they need welders. If you know HVAC or anything of that nature with those technical skills, they need those in corrections. It's one of those, this is the weird third branch that people don't think about. You think about the public and the private sector, but the specialized personnel within the corrections field is an important aspect in a potential career. So maybe you're taking these classes in this program because you're not sure what you want to do, but maybe you have a background in some kind of welding or machining or programming or surveillance or medical information, nursing, whatever it may be. There are positions in the corrections field for those niche, particular jobs, those specialized personnel. And so, what I'm trying to get forward at you, hopefully, with this is that the possible career choices within criminal justice as a whole and within corrections is not just limited to the obvious things. You can do more than just be an officer. You can do more than be a lawyer. There are plenty of options out there. But one of the big things that our text talks about, and realistically both textbooks talk about, and because this class has all been about intro to corrections as a field in a whole, we're going to talk about the kind of some of the duties and dangers that are with particularly correctional officers. Some of these are also applicable to those specialized personnel within the correctional facilities, but this does account for in a kind of across the board, but it's focused on correctional officers. And so across the texts, some of the duties are, things that are obvious and that we've talked about before. Enforce rules or laws and things of that nature. Inspect facilities, maintain order, report on conduct. Now, some of those we haven't used those exact terms, but we have talked about these things within a correctional facility, within a secured facility, whether private or public. There is an idea that you need to maintain order. This is both for a bailiff, this is for a correctional officer. the way things operate inside, part of the whole what if scenarios was to understand the maintaining order and enforcement of rules within a facility. So, right there, obviously, a duty and why there's been a decent amount of writing here in this class, as well as in this degree as a whole, is that in a lot of the criminal justice career pathways, no matter whether you want to be just a police officer or if you want to actually, go detective, um, correctional officer, parole officer, lawyer, legal assistant, whatever you want to go into, there is writing involved in criminal justice. Like, I know that's definitely not the thing you want to hear, but it's true. There are reports to be written, and reports not just for officers, but for a lot of positions within corrections, within criminal justice. You cannot avoid writing. And so it's important that you know how to obtain the information by taking it all in visually, using your senses, using your memory, but also your writing skills to be able to put forward all of the information required in a clear and concise way. So, one of the duties is to report on conduct, no matter what your field is in, or your subfield in this is. You have to, you will write reports of some kind. And then, obviously, as I already said, inspect facilities. This is part of the maintain order. You make sure things are looking correct. If something seems out of place, there's probably an issue. Obviously, dangers. I'm sure some of you can think of at least one. And one of that is the fact that you are working with incarcerated individuals. Yes. In corrections in particular, you are working with people who have been sentenced for a crime. So there tends to be a level of violence related to that. So you are at risk of being on the receiving end of violence, infectious disease. If you've worked anywhere where you are in somewhat tight living quarters or tight quarters, or you spend a good portion of your day indoors with individuals, no matter what disease you have, it spreads. One person gets the cold, everyone gets the cold. One person has something, another person's going to get it. It's the nature of infectious diseases. So, a real potential danger is that, yeah, disease can spread. If someone gets sick, you could get sick too. And of course, that ranges. Bloodborne diseases are a little bit more complicated. They are a potential risk, but not a high risk. It all depends on the situation that you're in. But obviously, with violence, there's also the issue of potential riots, which is a problem. But there's also, mentally unstable and unwell inmates might also be prone to violent actions that could potentially not only harm themselves but harm others. So it's important to know that it's not the safest job in the world. Like, there's no way nothing's ever going to happen to you, but it's not a high probability, depending on what particular area you go into. But these are some of the dangers that you face in this kind of field. And honestly, in any point of the criminal justice field, like, I know the focus is corrections here, but in the criminal justice field, you face risks of violence no matter what. Even if you're just a lawyer or a paralegal, you still have the risk of violence if you represent someone and that's not too savory, that you could face violence. So it's important to know. One of the less obvious, I would say, but one of you actually did put it as a question for Lieutenant Holman, was about stress. And so, yes, there is some research and data on this, but we still need more data. But we do see that there is psychosocial and psychological issues, as well as stress, that individuals within the criminal justice system as a whole, but in corrections, they face a lot of stress, and they face a lot of psychological issues: depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, these kinds of things that lead to other issues that compounding. One in particular that the text brings up that is important to know is the work family conflict. There is this general issue, and it has its own section, but it's part of work family conflict, is role conflict and role ambiguity. This issue of how you view it and what is there and the rules is a problem. You're there to maintain order and protect people, but sometimes to protect people, it looks like you have to hurt them. And how do you deal with that? Do you internally struggle, or do you just go for it? Do you fight against it? Do you choose to not do it and then potentially lose the job? And there's so many of these factors that come into just the simple idea that there is a conflict between what is expected of you and what you expect of the job. And so this plays into that work family conflict. You end up getting home after working, and how do you balance that between the authority that you have at work? Do you maintain that authority at home? I would hope not, because that would be a way heavier balance. And so there's a lot of issues with that across the board. Um, Kind of going back into some of the duties again, uh, as I said, there are reports, and our text number 2 even talks about some of these. Talks about the pre-sentencing investigation report, which we've talked about before. Hint, hint. We've also talked about just in general security. So you maintain order. That is through security. That is through uh, enforcing rules, making sure things are working. It also means understanding what kind of treatment that an individual needs. If you are a corrections officer, you tend to know what your particular client's needs are. And so that's just a kind of important piece. That's, do they need education, training, rehabilitation for substance abuse? What is it that they need? Um, but one thing in particular that I want to emphasize here and bring up is that another job, I guess, a role, a duty of corrections in general is, if you are a correctional officer, if you're a parole officer and your job is to be a case manager and watch over, one of your jobs ends up becoming community corrections and community outreach. If you recall, we've talked about several times how rehabilitation does not happen right away, and it's not a one and done thing. It starts on day one and it goes throughout the whole time. This means that when they're released, they are set up with the right program. So there should be some kind of understood uh, connection between the institution itself and the community that they are being released back into. And so it's just important to note that if you are working as a case manager, as a correctional officer, as a parole officer, part of that job might be working with community members and agencies to make sure that the clients who you are serving, the incarcerated individuals, are being correctly guided to make sure that they do not recidivate and do not repeat their crimes. And so, um, as you see, this is the last slide, so we're just going to leave it up. But before we go, I just kind of want to recall that Unit 4 was the third reading for this week, and it was talking about some of the unique populations and their unique needs. This falls under this duties of a correctional officer. Depending on the particular group you're working with, you might have to adjust how you operate. And so I put forward recall that we've talked about this. So right here is fair game on the final. Not obviously this particular conversation, but the content here is stuff we've talked about. And that's that juveniles are still growing. Their mental health and maturity have not finished developing. So cognitive behavioral treatment, CBT, is the focus in their rehabilitation. Female offenders tend to have a history of abuse and have the option to be pregnant, so that does change some of those factors. Mental illness does create issues regarding safety across the board, both for the individual and for others. And there are a host of problems with elderly inmates, both with accessibility of resources, ability to move, strength, things of that nature that are not the same as younger inmates. So, again, knowing that different groups have different needs is an important step in this process. But that's it for me. Like I said, really the focus this week should be on your final exam and getting that turned in and done. So please focus on that. Be sure to watch through the Mike Holman interview because he did answer questions that you all had. So thank you very much. Thank you for sticking through the class with me. And hopefully, I see you in another class. Bye.